The perimeter alarm never sounded. The motion sensors never triggered. The guard dogs never barked. At 0300 hours on a moonless night in 1991, 4 men walked through the most secure American military installation in the Middle East like ghosts passing through walls. They moved past sleeping sentries. They placed dummy explosives on fuel dumps and ammunition bunkers. They entered the base commander's quarters and leafied a calling card on his pillow. When the sun rose 6 hours later, a U.S. Army colonel stood in his command center staring at Polaroid photographs scattered across his desk. Each image showed a critical vulnerability. Each image was time-stamped. Each image was signed with 3 letters that would haunt American military doctrine for the next decade. SAS. We thought we were untouchable. A U.S. Air Force security officer later admitted in a classified Feeder Action report. We had the technology. We had the manpower. We had everything except the ability to stop 4 Brits with blackened faces. This is not a story about special forces conducting an operation against an enemy. This is a story about the moment American military confidence discovered its own blindness. This is a story about the patrol that didn't fire a shot, didn't speak a word, and didn't leave a trace until they wanted to be found. This is a story validated entirely through the testimony of the men they embarrassed, the systems they defeated, and the doctrine they forced an entire military to rewrite. Because before there were Navy SEAL consultants in Hollywood, before there were Delta Force video games and Ranger recruitment commercials, there were 4 men who proved that the deadliest weapon in modern warfare is not technology. It is not firepower. It is not even training. It is invisibility. Let me be clear about who these men were. Not through British pride or regimental mythology. Through American military intelligence assessments written in the weeks following what would become known as the Jouf incident, the Special Air Service, Britain's Tier 1 Special Forces unit founded in the North African desert in 1941 by a lieutenant who believed small teams could achieve what entire battalions could not. Refined through decades of counterinsurgency in Malaya, Oman, Northern Ireland, honed to a psychological edge in the Iranian embassy siege that shocked the world in 1980. But what made them different was not what they could do. Every Special Forces unit can shoot. What made them different was what the Pentagon's own threat assessment called their pathological commitment to remaining undetected until mission completion. Listen to how a U.S. Marine Corps intelligence officer described them in a 1989 briefing document. SAS doctrine prioritizes mission success over operator survival, stealth over speed, and psychological impact over tactical efficiency. They are trained to win before the enemy knows a battle has begun. Compare that to how a CIA field operative characterized them after a joint operation in Beirut. They don't think like soldiers. They think like burglars, professional, patient, willing to spend 72 hours in a hide site for 30 seconds of action, but the assessment that matters most came from a U.S. Army Delta Force operator who trained alongside them at Hereford in 1992. We teach our guys to dominate through superior firepower and aggression. The Brits teach theirs to dominate through making the enemy believe they were never there at all. 3 different American military organizations, 3 different operational contexts. 1. Consistent observation. The SAS did not fight wars the way Hollywood taught Americans to expect. They fought wars the way nightmares work. Silent, sudden, psychologically devastating. And in early 1991, they were about to teach the U.S. military a lesson it had never asked for. To understand why this happened, you need to understand what the American military had become by the time Operation Desert Shield began. December 1990. 5 months after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, the largest military buildup since Vietnam was underway in Saudi Arabia. Hundreds of thousands of American troops, thousands of armored vehicles, hundreds of aircraft, the most technologically advanced fighting force ever assembled. And with that technology came confidence that bordered on arrogance. U.S. military installations in the Arabian Peninsula operated under a doctrine called defense in depth. Multiple security layers, electronic surveillance, thermal imaging, motion sensors, armed patrols, attack dogs, quick reaction forces. The Pentagon had spent billions developing systems designed to make American bases impenetrable. We had sensors that could detect a rabbit at 400 meters. A U.S. Army security specialist wrote in his incident report. We had cameras with thermal imaging that could spot body heat through camouflage netting. We had protocols that required 3 forms of identification just to enter the perimeter. But there was a problem that American military planners had not anticipated. A problem that would only become visible when 4 men exploited it with surgical precision. The entire security architecture was designed to detect threats that wanted to be detected. Vehicles approaching checkpoints, aircraft entering restricted airspace, personnel attempting to breach fences. The sensors were calibrated for invasion. The protocols were written for assault. No one had designed defenses against men who had no intention of being seen at all. The request came through official channels. British Special Forces liaison to CENTCOM, a training exercise. Red Team penetration testing. Standard operating procedure for joint Allied operations. The Americans approved it without hesitation. Why wouldn't they? This was 1991. The Cold War was over. The United States had just watched its technology dismantle Iraqi air defenses in the opening hours of Desert Storm. American military doctrine was riding high on precision-guided munitions and stealth aircraft. What could 4 British soldiers possibly teach them that their own technology had not already proven? A U.S. Air Force Base commander signed the authorization on January 15th. He granted the SAS patrol permission to attempt infiltration of a forward operating base in northern Saudi Arabia, not the main logistics hub, not CENTCOM headquarters, a secondary airfield, important but not critical. A facility that housed 2 squadrons of attack helicopters, fuel storage for 300,000 gallons of aviation gas, and a company of military police trained specifically in base security. The rules of engagement were simple. The SS team had 72 hours to penetrate the perimeter, gather intelligence on base layout and security procedures, and exfiltrate without being detected. If caught, the exercise would end. If successful, they would provide recommendations for security improvements. We thought we were doing them a favor, the base commander later told investigators. We thought we were giving them a chance to learn from American security doctrine. The SAS patrol leader, a captain with 12 years of experience in covert operations, read the authorization and said nothing. He simply nodded, saluted, and walked out of the briefing room with his 3-man team. They did not ask questions about the base layout. They did not request maps or intelligence briefings. They did not want to know patrol schedules or security protocols, because asking would have told the Americans what they planned to look for. Instead, they drove to a position 5 kilometers from the base perimeter. They parked their Land Rover in a wadi that hid it from aerial observation. They pulled camouflage netting over the vehicle. They lay prone in the sand with binoculars and notepads, and they watched. For 48 hours they did nothing but observe. This is where American military doctrine collided with British Special Forces philosophy. This is where technology met patience. This is where defensive systems designed by engineers encounter defensive tactics refined by men who had spent decades learning to see what others missed. The SAS does not teach its operators to breach defenses. It teaches them to map the invisible rhythms that all defenses create. Guard shift changes, patrol routes, equipment maintenance schedules, the unconscious patterns that emerge whenever human beings perform repetitive security tasks. We watched them change shift feeds at 0600 and 1800, the SAS patrol leader wrote in his feeder action report. We noted that the perimeter patrol walked the same route in the same sequence every 4 hours. We observed that guard dogs were kennelled during daylight hours due to heat. We documented that motion sensors along the eastern fence line were deactivated for 30 minutes during the noon prayer call to prevent false alarms from blowing sand. They did not just watch the base. They watched the sky, cloud cover, moon phases, weather patterns. They noted that on their second night of observation, a sandstorm rolled in from the north at 2200 hours. They recorded that visibility dropped to less than 50 meters. They documented that perimeter patrols retreated to covered positions and that electronic sensors became unreliable in the blowing sand. And they made a decision. They would not try to breach the defenses when the defenses were strong. They would wait for the moment when nature itself created the gaps that technology could not close. On their third night, January 18th, weather forecasts predicted another sandstorm, winds gusting to 40 knots, visibility near zero, conditions that would ground helicopters and reduce thermal imaging to static. At 2100 hours, the SAS team applied camouflage cream to their faces, necks, and hands, not the green and brown patterns American forces used. Pure black, the kind of black that does not reflect moonlight or starlight, the kind of black that makes a human silhouette disappear against night desert. They carried no weapons, no radios, no equipment that could be used to identify them if discovered. Each man wore a chest rig containing only what they needed for the mission: wire cutters, camera, notebook, pencil, chalk, black tape. At 2200 hours, the wind began to rise. By 2230, sand was blowing horizontally across the desert floor. By 2300 hours, the storm had reduced visibility to less than 30 meters. The four men rose from their hide position and began walking toward the base. What happened next was not dramatic. There was no firefight, no alarms, no desperate sprints through searchlight beams. What happened next was four men exploiting a truth that American security doctrine had never fully internalized. Electronic sensors are useless if no one is watching the monitors. Guard dogs are ineffective if they cannot leave their kennels. Motion detectors are meaningless if sandstorms trigger them every 30 seconds. And human guards cannot see threats they are not trained to recognize. The SAS team reached the perimeter fence at 2345. They did not climb over it. They did not cut through it. They walked along it until they found what they had observed 2 nights earlier: a drainage culvert that ran beneath the fence, a culvert designed to prevent flooding during rare desert rains, a culvert that appeared on no security diagram because it was classified as civil engineering infrastructure, not a defensive barrier. They crawled through, one at a time, moving slowly, pausing every few meters to listen, not for alarms, for the absence of sound that would indicate someone had noticed their presence. At 0015 hours, all four men were inside the perimeter. They did not head for the most obvious targets. They did not move toward aircraft eat or fuel dumps. Instead, they headed for the one location that would prove they understood American military psychology better than the Americans understood their own vulnerabilities: the base commander's quarters. Listen to how a military police investigator described what they found the next morning. The intruders entered through a window that had been leaf-feet unlocked because it was covered by an external security camera. They bypassed the camera by approaching from an angle the lens could not cover. They leaf-feet no fingerprints, no footprints, no physical evidence of entry except what they deliberately chose to leave behind. What they chose to leave behind was a Polaroid photograph of the base commander sleeping in his bed. The photograph was taken from less than 2 meters away. It was placed on his desk with a handwritten note: "You were very loud when you snored. We didn't want to wake you. Regards, 22 SAS." But the commander's quarters were just the beginning. What the SAS team did over the next 4 hours would force the United States military to completely reevaluate its understanding of base security. They moved through the installation like surgeons performing an autopsy. Methodical, thorough, leaving evidence of their presence only where they wanted it to be found. At 0100 hours, they photographed 6 A-864 Apache helicopters parked on the flight line. They placed chalk marks on rotor assemblies. They leaf-feet tape on fuel access panels. They took Polaroids showing exact tail numbers and weapons configurations. At 0200s, they entered the fuel depot, a facility that stored enough aviation gas to keep the squadron operational for 3 weeks. A facility that was supposed to be guarded by armed sentries and protected by motion-activated floodlights. They placed dummy demolition charges made of modeling clay and road flares on 6 separate fuel bladders. They photographed each charge with a timestamp visible in the frame. At 0300 hours, they entered the armory, a hardened structure that required biometric identification and armed escort access according to standing orders. They photographed serial numbers on crew-served weapons. They left notes indicating which weapons had not been properly secured. They placed a business card on the duty officer's desk. "You might want to check your locks. They're not as secure as you think." But the moment that would become legend, the moment that would be retold in Special Forces training courses for decades, happened at 0400 in the Base Operations Center. The Operations Center was the nerve system of the entire facility: radios, computers, classified communications equipment, maps showing troop dispositions and planned operations. It was supposed to be the most secure location on the entire base. 24-hour manning, armed guards at the entrance, cipher locks on all doors, security cameras monitoring every approach. The SAS team walked in through an unlocked maintenance access panel in the ceiling. A U.S. Army signals officer was sitting at the communications desk when he heard a sound behind him. He turned. 4 men in black with faces like shadows were standing 3 meters away. One of them raised a finger to his lips in the universal gesture for silence. Here is what the signals officer wrote in his statement. I thought I was hallucinating. They shouldn't have been able to get within 100 meters of that building. They definitely shouldn't have been inside it. I reached for the alarm button and one of them just shook his head. Not threatening, just calm, like he was telling me there was no point. The patrol leader stepped forward and placed a Polaroid camera on the desk. He pointed at the classified operations map on the wall. He pointed at the officer. He mimed taking a photograph. The officer, still too shocked to process what was happening, nodded. The SAS soldier took a photograph of himself standing next to the operations map. He took a photograph of his teammate sitting in the base commander's chair. He took a photograph of the classified communications equipment with serial numbers visible. Then he walked back to the signals officer, handed him the Polaroids, and spoke the only words any of them would say during the entire operation. You might want to give these to your commander when he wakes up. Then they disappeared back through the ceiling panel. By the time the signals officer hit the alarm 30 seconds later, they were already outside the operations center. By the time the quick reaction force arrived 2 minutes after that, they were outside the perimeter fence. By the time helicopters were in the air searching for them 5 minutes later, they were back in their hide position 15 kilometers away, brewing tea and watching the chaos unfold through binoculars. The exercise was supposed to last 72 hours. It lasted 6. Because by 0600 hours, when the base commander woke up and found a photograph of himself sleeping on his desk, the entire installation was in lockdown trying to understand how 4 men had turned their security into a joke. The Afeeder action briefing happened 3 days later in a conference room at CENTCOM headquarters in Riyadh. The room was packed with American military officers, security specialists, intelligence analysts, military police investigators, Delta Force observers, Navy SEAL representatives, everyone who needed to understand what had just been exposed. The SAS patrol leader stood at the front of the room with his 3 teammates. He did not present slides. He did not use PowerPoint. He simply placed 73 Polaroid photographs on the table in chronological order. Each photograph documented a critical security failure. Each photograph proved that American defensive doctrine had been based on assumptions rather than tested vulnerabilities. We did not breach your security, he said in the clipped accent that would become infamous in U.S. Special Operations circles. We walked through gaps that were always there. You were simply not trained to see them. A U.S. Army colonel interrupted. You had inside information. You had to have known patrol schedules and security protocols. The SAS captain shook his head. We watched you for 48 hours. You told us everything we needed to know through your own patterns. Guard shy feats at the same time every day, patrols following the same routes. Dogs kenneled during heat, sensors deactivated during prayer calls. You built a security system that works perfectly against threats that announce themselves. We simply chose not to announce ourselves. But it was what he said next that would change how the U.S. military thought about base defense for the next 2 decades. Your technology is impressive. Your manpower is substantial. Your defensive positions are well constructed. But you have made the same mistake every conventional force makes. You have confused visible security with actual security. You have assumed that sensors and cameras and armed guards create safety.
They do not. They create the illusion of safety.
And illusions can be exploited by anyone trained to see them. A military police brigadier general stood up. So what do you recommend? The ASS captain smiled, not arrogantly. Just the tired smile of a man who had spent 12 years learning lessons the hard way. Train your guards to be unpredictable. Change patrol routes every shy feet, vary guard change times. Test your own sensors regularly by trying to defeat them. Assume that any defensive system you can understand can be defeated by someone who studies it longer than you. And most importantly, stop assuming that technology can replace human awareness. He paused. We took 73 photographs. We could have taken 700. We entered 11 buildings. We could have entered every building on this base. We placed dummy charges on 6 fuel bladders. We could have destroyed your entire fuel supply. We did not do these things because this was an exercise. But if we had been hostile forces, your technology would not have saved you. Your manpower would not have saved you. The only thing that could have saved you was having someone who knew what to look for actually looking. The room was silent because everyone present understood what had just been laid bare. The United States military had spent billions of dollars building defenses against the last war, against conventional threats, against enemies who would come loud and obvious and detectable. They had not built defenses against enemies who understood that modern warfare is not won by the side with better weapons. It is won by the side that decides when and where the weapons will be used, and that decision belongs to whoever controls visibility. The official Feeder Action Report was classified secret and distributed to every U.S. Special Operations Command. It was 37 pages long. It contained detailed recommendations for security protocol improvements. It included photographs and diagrams and technical analysis. But buried in Appendix C was a section that would become required reading at Fort Bragg and Dam Neck and every facility where American Special Operations Forces trained. It was titled, Psychological Analysis of Adversary Methodology. Here is what it said. The SAS patrols succeeded not through superior equipment or physical capability, but through superior understanding of human psychology. They recognized that security personnel develop unconscious patterns. They recognized that technology creates dependency that can be exploited. They recognized that confidence in defensive systems breeds complacency in the humans operating those systems. The report continued. American military doctrine emphasizes force projection and technological superiority. This emphasis has created a blind spot. We train our personnel to win battles through superior firepower. We do not adequately train them to prevent battles through superior awareness. The SAS operates on a different philosophy. They train to win before the enemy knows they are present. But the most damning paragraph came at the end. Until this exercise, U.S. forces had never been systematically tested by an adversary trained to exploit psychological vulnerabilities rather than physical defenses. The results demonstrate a critical gap in our defensive doctrine. We have built fortresses with doors we did not know existed. 3 months after the Jouf incident, the U.S. military implemented new security protocols at every installation in the Middle East. Random patrol patterns, variable shy feet times, dedicated red team units tasked with testing base defenses, mandatory training on threat recognition that did not rely on technology. The protocols were written by a joint task force that included SAS advisors, because the Americans had learned something that Hollywood never taught and that no amount of technology could replace. The deadliest threat is not the one that announces itself with explosions and gunfire. The deadliest threat is the one that teaches you about your own vulnerabilities by walking through them, so quietly that you never hear them coming. Here is what this story is not about. It is not about British superiority over American forces. It is not about mocking U.S. military capability. Every special operations veteran knows that the difference between SAS and Delta, between SBS and SEAL Team 6, is not capability, but philosophy. American Special Forces are among the most effective direct action units ever created. They can assault a compound, clear a building, extract a target with speed and precision that few forces can match. They are trained to dominate through aggressive action and overwhelming violence of execution. But the SAS comes from a different tradition. A tradition born in the North African desert when David Sterling realized that 550 men destroying 550 aircraft was more valuable than 500 men capturing 500 prisoners. A tradition refined through decades of operating in places where failure meant death and success meant no one ever knew you were there. Listen to how a Delta Force operator described the difference of feeder training with 22 SAS at Hereford. We train to kick down doors and win the fight. They train to pick the lock and make sure there is no fight. Both approaches work. They just solve different problems. Or how a SEAL Team 6 member characterized it, a feat or a joint operation in Afghanistan. American Special Forces are like a sledgehammer. Fast, powerful, devastating. The SAS is like a scalpel, precise, invisible, psychologically destructive. You use different tools for different jobs. But what the Jouf incident revealed was not that one approach was better than the other. It revealed that American military culture had become so focused on technological superiority that it had stopped teaching the fundamentals of field graffiti that every special operator needs regardless of their primary mission set. The U.S. Army's own analysis said it best. We had forgotten that electronics fail, batteries die, and sensors can be fooled. The SAS reminded us that the most reliable weapon system is a trained human being who knows how to observe, adapt, and exploit human nature. Within a year, every American Special Operations Selection Course had incorporated modules on covert approach, long-duration observation, and psychological operations. Not because the Americans wanted to become like the SAS, because they wanted to ensure that no one could ever again demonstrate such a complete gap in their defensive awareness. The irony is perfect. The SAS conducted that exercise to help their allies, to strengthen coalition security, to share lessons learned from decades of operating in hostile environments. And in doing so, they accidentally created the most effective training evolution in modern special operations history, because sometimes the best teacher is the one who shows you how wrong you were without saying a word. If you watch American war movies, you will see a very specific version of military excellence. Explosions, firefights, last stands, heroes charging into danger with flags waving and soundtracks swelling. Hollywood has spent 70 years teaching audiences that war is won by courage and firepower and dramatic sacrifice. This story exposes that mythology as the comfortable lie it has always been. The SAS patrol that infiltrated Jouf did not fire a weapon, did not speak except for one sentence, did not engage in physical combat, did not create any moment that would look dramatic on screen. And yet they achieved complete tactical dominance over a facility defended by hundreds of American troops with millions of dollars in technology. They did it through patience, observation, understanding of human psychology, and the willingness to spend 48 hours lying in sand watching guard chiefs when every instinct screamed to take action. This is what makes elite forces elite. Not physical capability, not weapon systems, not even training, though training matters. What makes elite forces elite is the psychological discipline to do the hard, boring, invisible work that creates the conditions for success before anyone knows a mission has begun. Special operations is 95% waiting and 5% action, a retired SAS warrant officer said in an interview years later, but that 95% is where battles are won or lost. Because if you do the waiting right, the action becomes inevitable. American audiences were raised on stories of Rangers and airborne and Marines storming beaches under fire. Those stories are true. Those men were heroes. Their sacrifices were real. But those are not the only stories. They are not even the most important stories. They are just the stories that are easy to film, and easy to sell, and easy to turn into myths that make us feel good about how wars are won. The stories that Hollywood will never tell are the ones like Jouf. 4 men walking through a base without firing a shot. 4 men defeating an entire security apparatus through understanding rather than violence. 4 men proving that the highest form of military skill is not destroying the enemy, but making the enemy destroy their own confidence in their defenses. Those stories do not sell tickets. They do not generate merchandise. They do not create recruiting commercials, but they create something more valuable. They create humility. They create awareness that military excellence comes in forms that cameras cannot capture and audiences cannot recognize. They create understanding that the best operators are not the ones you see on screen. They are the ones you never see at all. 20 years after the Jouf incident, the U.S. military still uses that exercise as a case study in its advanced security courses, not as an embarrassment. As a gefeat, because that one night taught lessons that no amount of classroom instruction could have conveyed, the SAS patrol leader who led that mission retired as a major in 1998. He never spoke publicly about the operation. When journalists asked him about it, he simply said, "We were there to help our allies identify vulnerabilities. We identified them. The Americans fixed them. That is what allies do." But the 3 teammates who were with him that night all went on to senior leadership positions in British Special Forces. One became commanding officer of 22 SAS. One became director of UK Special Forces. One became a strategic advisor to NATO on counter-terrorism operations. All three credited that single mission as the moment they truly understood what special operations meant. Not spectacular raids, not dramatic rescues, not Hollywood moments. Special operations meant understanding your enemy better than they understood themselves. It meant exploiting psychology as much as terrain. It meant winning battles through making the enemy realize they had already lost before the first shot was fired. The U.S. base commander whose quarters were infiltrated that night wrote in his private journal, "I have commanded soldiers in combat. I have led men under fire. I have made decisions that cost lives and saved lives." But that morning when I woke up and saw that photograph, I felt something I had never felt in 20 years of service. I felt what it was like to be completely outmatched by an enemy I never saw coming, he continued. It was the most valuable lesson of my career, because it taught me that confidence without awareness is just arrogance. Technology without human intelligence is just expensive equipment, and security without testing is just theater. Those 4 men gave us a guy feed. They showed us our own vulnerabilities without making us pay the price enemies would have extracted. That commander went on to lead the task force that rewrote U.S.-based security protocols for the entire Department of Defense. Those protocols are still in use today. Every time a red team tests American defenses, every time security personnel vary their patrol routes, every time a guard is trained to look for what does not belong rather than what sensors can detect, they are applying lessons learned from 4 men who walked through a fortress and leaf-eat nothing but photographs. Let me tell you what this story really means. Not as history, as warning. Every military believes it has learned the lessons of the last war. Every generation of soldiers believes their technology makes them invulnerable. Every security force believes their defenses are adequate until someone proves otherwise. The SAS proved otherwise at Jouf. But they were not the first, and they will not be the last. Because the fundamental truth of warfare has not changed in 10,000 years. The side that controls when and where battle happens has already won. And controlling that decision requires invisibility, patience, and psychological understanding that no technology can provide. American military doctrine has improved dramatically since 1991. The lessons of Jouf have been internalized. Red team exercises are now standard practice. Security forces are trained to think like infiltrators. But new technologies create new blind spots. Drone surveillance creates dependency on overhead imagery. Electronic sensors create faith in automated detection. Biometric security creates belief that identity verification prevents access. Every advancement creates new vulnerabilities that will remain invisible until someone trained to see them exploits them. The question is not whether those vulnerabilities exist. They do. They always will. The question is whether they will be discovered by allies during training or by enemies during combat. Whether the lessons will be learned through embarrassment or through body counts. The SAS chose to teach through embarrassment. They could have written a report explaining theoretical vulnerabilities. Instead, they proved those vulnerabilities existed by exploiting them so thoroughly that no one could deny the threat. That is what true allies do. They do not tell you what you want to hear. They show you what you need to see. Even when it is uncomfortable, especially when it is uncomfortable. Because the most dangerous enemy is not the one who tries to destroy you through force. It is the one who allows you to destroy yourself through complacency. If this story has changed how you think about military excellence, if it has shown you a version of special operations that Hollywood will never sell, then I have done my job. Because the goal of this channel is not to glorify war or celebrate violence, it is to reveal the reality that exists behind the myths, the reality that elite forces around the world already know, but that audiences rarely see. War is not won by heroes charging into gunfire. It is won by professionals who spend 48 hours watching guard sheafeats to find 30 seconds of opportunity. It is won by men who understand that the highest form of courage is not facing death, but facing boredom, while waiting for the perfect moment. It is won by soldiers who know that the best operation is the one no one realizes happened until it is too late to stop it. The SAS did not infiltrate Jouf to prove they were better than Americans. They did it to prove that security without testing is fantasy. That technology without awareness is vulnerability. That confidence without humility is the first step toward defeat. And they proved it so completely, so undeniably, that the United States military had no choice but to listen, no choice but to learn. No choice but to acknowledge that sometimes the most valuable thing an ally can do is show you the doors you did not know existed. That is the real story. Not British versus American. Not special forces versus conventional forces. Not technology versus tactics. The real story is that military excellence requires constant questioning of your own assumptions, constant testing of your own defenses, constant willingness to learn from anyone who can teach you, regardless of how uncomfortable the lesson might be. The 4 men who walked through Jouf that night are not famous. Their names were never released. Their faces never appeared in newspapers. They received no medals, no public recognition, no Hollywood adaptations. They just went back to their unit, wrote their reports, and moved on to the next mission. Because that is what professionals do. They do the job, they teach the lesson, they improve the capability, and then they disappear into the shadows where they have always worked best. If you found this story valuable, if you want to hear more accounts of military excellence that challenge Hollywood narratives, hit that like button so YouTube knows this content matters. Subscribe so you never miss the next story. And share this with someone who still thinks special operations looks like what they see in movies, because the truth is more interesting than fiction. The reality is more impressive than myth, and the lessons are more valuable than entertainment. The SAS taught the U.S. military how to see what they were missing. I am teaching you the same thing. Not about base security. About how war actually works when the cameras are not rolling and the narratives are not simplified for mass consumption. Welcome to Declassified War, where the stories are validated by the enemies who lived them, where the lessons are taught by the soldiers who learned them the hard way, where the truth is more powerful than any script Hollywood could write, because sometimes the best weapon is not the one that destroys the enemy. It is the one that teaches them they were never as secure as they thought they were, and 4 men with blackened faces and Polaroid cameras just taught that lesson better than 1,000 bombs ever could.